Miss Marple and the Mirror that Cracked on Its Own. Chapter 1. A pleasant day turned grim. The morning of the St. Mildred summer fete dawned with that rare sort of perfection that could make even the most cynical of St. Mary Mead's residents remark upon the weather. The air was mild, the roses along the churchyard wall drooped with scented heaviness, and the bunting, faded from years of service, fluttered with polite enthusiasm in the breeze. Miss Jane Marple, in her pale blue straw hat with a ribbon she had sewn on herself the night before, strolled along the gravel path toward the green. She had already stopped to admire Mrs. Bantry's delphiniums, which she had to admit were looking rather fine this year, though Mrs. Bantry was quick to attribute their health to a new proprietary feed, One Simply Must Try. The fete was one of those occasions that seemed unchanging from year to year. The cake stall run by Mrs. Price Ridley with her air of proprietorship, the tombola where Colonel Melchett looked faintly bewildered by the ticketing system, and the white elephant stall where Mrs. Hartnell held court over a curious assortment of mismatched china, dusty figurines, and half-broken trinkets. But the center of attention this year, besides the vicar's rumored speech, was a charity auction hosted under the large white marquee. Among the lots was a curious object that had already stirred murmurs among the villagers, an antique hand-framed mirror, its silvering mottled with age, said to have hung in the upstairs corridor of Old Parsonage House before its recent sale to a London couple. It was not an especially beautiful thing. Its frame, carved in the heavy, elaborate style of the 1830s, was chipped in places and its surface clouded. But there was something about it, an air of history, perhaps, that drew the eye. Mrs. Price Ridley confided to anyone who would listen that it was quite out of place among the linen tea cloths and crystal decanters on offer, though Miss Marple, glancing at it with mild interest, thought there was a certain curious quality to the way it caught the light. The auction began in good spirits. Mr. Denham, the auctioneer, was a tall man with a ready laugh and a knack for coaxing a bid from even the most reluctant villager. The Mirror came up midway through the sale, and there was a faint ripple of interest. Two bidders, a tall, angular woman in dove gray named Mrs. Charlotte Blackwell, a newcomer to village, and old Mr. Simpkins, the retired solicitor, seemed equally determined to have it. The bids rose steadily, the small crowd leaning forward in that quiet thrill of watching two people spend more than they had likely intended. At £12, Mr. Simpkins hesitated. At £13, Mrs. Blackwell secured the piece with a nod of satisfaction. Then, Dr. Hayward had drawn a discreet canvas screen, borrowed from the theatrical stall, around the far table and spoken in a low voice with Mrs. Lenton. His tone, while kind, admitted no ambiguity. "No, my dear, not a seizure. We must telephone the station." The word station ran through the green like a breeze. Police. One heard it at the Coconut Shy, and again beneath the elm where the parish council had been selling raffle tickets. Mrs. Price Ridley, who believed in order as she believed in starch, sniffed and said to Mrs. Hartnell, "Of course it is the heat. The doctor is obliged to sound grave. There are regulations." Upon which Mrs. Hartnell, whose brother had once written the Times and therefore considered herself an authority, announced, "Sunstroke, nothing more," though privately she wondered if poor Mr. Simpkins had been carrying on with someone quite unsuitable and paid for it with his nerves. At the tea tent, where cups clinked in that oddly muffled way that suggests people are listening for something else, speculation arranged itself into tidy slices, like the seed cake. Mr. Simpkins had been a solicitor. Solicitors dealt in wills. Wills produce quarrels. There you were. "Mark my words," said Mr. Pottle, who mended shoes and consciences with equal zeal. "There'll be a legacy at the root of it." His wife, a gentle woman with a soft spot for mysteries, thought of poison with shuddering relish, and at once felt wicked. Mrs. Bantry arrived with a gust of scent and sensible sympathy, gathering a small court without intending to. "I never liked Mr. Simpkins's color," she confided, meaning she had never considered him robust. "A sort of saffron behind the ears. One oughtn't be saffron behind the ears." She bought 2 slices of gingerbread for the comfort of the thing, then lowered her voice. Still, the doctor said, "Well, not natural. I always think, if a thing isn't natural, it is very likely unnatural." A truism that, in Mrs. Bantry's arrangement, sounded like insight. It was curious how quickly the cracked mirror became, in the echoing chambers of village talk, a sort of accomplice. Superstition, usually worn lightly in St. Mary Mead, found a convenient hook. 7 years, said a girl from the Brownies with solemnity beyond her years. 7 years of dreadful things. She had heard from her mother, who had heard it from a cousin in Bournemouth, and by the time it reached the jam stall, the Mirror was, in rumor at least, that piece of bad luck from the parsonage. People glanced at it with furtive interest, as if it might crack further under their gaze, and occasionally someone ventured close, only to retreat without quite knowing why. Miss Marple, having procured a modest cup of barley water, "Only a little, thank you, there's always so much sugar," found a chair near the edge of the tent, and allowed herself to be unimportant. She was very good at that, at sitting so that one forgot she was there, at knitting a few quiet rows of plain, while the pattern of people's talk unrolled itself before her. She had no knitting just now, but her hands, folded neatly, looked as if they might be hiding a pair of needles. Her eyes, mild and limpid, passed over faces with that gentle attention that makes even a reticent person volunteer a detail. She watched Mrs. Charlotte Blackwell, the newcomer in dove gray, accept a chair offered by the schoolmaster. Mrs. Blackwell's poise was a kind acquired in places where one learned never to be flustered in public. She sat tall, ankles precisely crossed, and thanked no fewer than 3 people for solicitous comments without, Miss Marple noticed, answering any of them. Her handbag rested on her lap as if it belonged there by right, and her gaze went once, only once, toward the canvas screen. It returned at once to the rim of her cup. A capable woman, Miss Marple thought, but not an easy one, not unkind, perhaps, simply arranged. Mr. Denham, the auctioneer, stood near the trestle where the lots had been displayed, looking at his own hand with a frown, as if the mirror's crack had cut him, though it had not. "I lifted it as I always do," he told Colonel Melchett when the latter came up. Flat palm, steady, no jar. It sounded, oh, like a pistol shot. He laughed uneasily. "Forgive me. Poor taste." "No harm meant," said the Colonel. "You've not noticed anything amiss with it before?" "Clouded, yes. The silvering. But that's its age, sir. No crack. Not a line." "A curious thing," said the Colonel, whose business was not curiosities but practicalities. He made a note on the back of a raffle booklet and, not knowing what else to do with the mirror, told the churchwardens to leave it where it was. They obeyed, relieved to have a task that did not involve looking behind the screen. The vicar moved among his flock with a grave gentleness that made people lower their voices. He had a word for Mrs. Simpkins, who was not present. She had never enjoyed fêtes and would need to be told, and a whisper for Mrs. Linton, who had gone rather pale when Dr. Hayward spoke. "There's a time to weep," the vicar murmured. Then, because a fête was still a fête, he asked that the brass band play something soothing. They chose a hymn and performed it at a tempo that suggested the conductor wished to be respectful and brisk at once. From these faded threads of sound, talk wove itself anew. Near the tombola, a knot of men discussed Mr. Simpkins's habits. He was a careful fellow, not much for drink, kept a neat garden, paid his club dues on time, a trifle sharp in business, said one who felt he had been charged too much for release, though he would admit it only in a group. An elderly charwoman, unacknowledged by the men, remarked to her companion that Mr. Simpkins had changed his milkman recently, said there was water in it, and her companion, whose sister's cousin was married to a dairyman, lifted her chin. They all put water, only some does it properly. At the edge of the green, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Bantry again, who pressed her hand. "My dear Jane, what a day! Poor Mr. Simpkins. You will say I am fanciful, but that mirror. Did you notice the way Charlotte Blackwell looked at it?" "No. Perhaps I imagined it. She's so very composed. It's almost a style." "Composure," said Miss Marple mildly, "is often very tiring to maintain. It is like lace. It snags upon the least thing." She looked across to the auction trestle. The crack in the mirror had taken on the character of a grin. "I think," she added, almost to herself, "that we shall learn something useful about it, though perhaps not at once." "About the mirror?" "About the people who looked at it." She smiled. "Mirrors are such revealing things, even when they are cloudy." A thin young man with ink on his cuffs, Mr. Pritchard, the sub-postmaster, approached with an air of bringing news. "Inspector Slack is on his way," he announced, pleased to be the bearer of a name. They telephoned from the vicarage. The line was engaged twice. Imagine! And then it went through. "Slack," said Mrs. Bantry, "is the one who raises his eyebrows at everything." "An economical man," said Miss Marple. "Eyebrows are so expressive." She thanked Mr. Pritchard and watched him go, moving with the peculiar self-importance of those who know a fact first by 5 minutes. By degrees, the talk eddied toward motive, as talk will. Mrs. Hartnell had it on good authority, her own supposition, dresser company, that Mr. Simpkins had been pressing a widow about her rent. The widow was named in one group as Mrs. Larch, in another as Mrs. Large, and in a third as the one with the boy who whistles, which last description Miss Marple thought likeliest to be accurate. Someone else recalled that Mr. Simpkins had overseen the sale of Old Parsonage House to the London couple, and wondered aloud if there had been odd goings-on about residues and fixtures. "Fixtures," said Mr. Pottle, "are always the devil," and felt pleased with the general laughter. All this while Miss Marple listened for the hesitations. There were, she found, several little pauses of the kind that betrayed knowledge rather than ignorance. Mrs. Price Ridley, so ready with opinion, was curiously cautious on one point. She would not say how she knew that the mirror had been donated by friends of the parish, though the phrasing was unlike her and had clearly been repeated verbatim. Mr. Denham's account of lifting the mirror was identical each time he told it. Identical down to the order of adjectives, a sign, not a line, but a rehearsal against uncertainty. And Mrs. Blackwell, thanked for her forbearance as a successful bidder of a damaged lot, accepted apologies with an air of relief so quiet it was almost imperceptible, relief being an odd sentiment in a woman deprived, even symbolically, of her purchase. She considered, too, the arrangements of tables, the paths worn into the grass by the afternoon's feet, the shaded places where one might pause unseen. The tea-tent's urn had been placed at the far end. The cups were two kinds, white china and a floral set with hairline crazing. She had seen Mr. Simpkins take a cup from the floral stack. She had seen him stand with it near the auction trestle, speaking to the schoolmaster in a low, irritated tone. She had not, however, seen him drink. "Miss Marple, dear," said Mrs. Lennon softly, appearing at her elbow with that churchwoman's knack of moving soundlessly. "The vicar begs you would come a moment, if you are not too tired." Under the composed words lay an appeal, for which Miss Marple felt a gentle affection. The young, she thought, always imagined calamity could be managed if only they had the right elder to hand. She went with Mrs. Lenton to the vicarage gate, where Colonel Melchett waited, his hat off in courtesy. "Inspector Slack will wish to speak to those nearest the occurrence," he said. Mrs. Lenton suggested you were present when it happened. "Near enough," said Miss Marple. "I saw nothing that anyone else could not have seen, Colonel, but one does sometimes notice what others do not value." The Colonel looked grimly amused. "That, Miss Marple, is why I am very glad you are here." She inclined her head. "The village is always here," she said gently. "One learns, after a time, to listen to it." Her gaze went back once more to Marquis, to the cracked mirror and the uncertain hum around it, and then to the patch of grass where a chair stood slightly out of line with the others, as if a man had risen in haste and left his place untidy. "People," Miss Marple added, almost as if reminding herself, "are fond of tidying what they think is disorder and leaving alone what truly is." She turned toward the vicarage steps, where the dark mouth of the telephone alcove waited, promising the next phase of bustle and borrowed authority. Behind her, the brass band finished their hymn and began, uncertainly, a waltz no one felt much like dancing to. The fate, like a patient who insists on rising too soon, attempted to go on, and all about the green, the gossip settled for a moment into a hush that was not silence so much as drawing breath, ready, as evening drew on, for the first questions to become suspicions, and the first suspicions to harden, as they always do, into theories. Chapter 3. The First Clues and Suspicions. Inspector Slack arrived with the brisk air of a man determined not to waste time, though the briskness was tempered by the faintly wary glance he gave Miss Marple when Colonel Melchett, with a certain satisfaction, introduced them, Slack's appearance, neat tweed, a faint dusting of road grit on the trouser cuffs, did not disguise the fact that he had driven straight from the station. His eyes swept the Fate as one might survey a chessboard, and his jaw set when he spotted the canvas screen still in place. He nodded once to Dr. Hayward, took in the colonel's brief report, and then asked that everyone who had seen or heard anything unusual be gathered. Unusual, as it turned out, was a matter of definition. In St. Mary Mead, unusual might mean a stranger on the lane or the vicar wearing a tie of the wrong shade. Within minutes, Slack was being offered recollections that ranged from a small boy's complaint that the sponge cake was dry to Mrs. Bantry's declaration that the mirror had cracked, as if on cue, like those stage effects one reads about in the theater columns. The inspector listened with a patience that was partly professional, partly the experience of knowing that occasionally, amid the embroidery, one found a genuine thread. He questioned Mr. Denham first. "You lifted it carefully?" "As I always do, sir. By the frame. There was no knock or jolt." "And you didn't see anyone near beforehand?" "No one closer than the table." He hesitated. "Though the lot cards, those numbered tags, one of them had slipped. I bent to pick it up just before holding up the mirror." "Where was the tag?" "Under the table edge. Could have dropped there earlier." Miss Marple, listening from a nearby chair, tilted her head slightly. People often forgot the ordinary in moments of strain. A bent back, a hand under a table. Those were the seconds in which anything small but decisive might be done. The inspector moved on to Mrs. Blackwell, whose composure was as neatly pressed as her skirt. She answered his questions with clipped civility. "You bid for the mirror." "Why?" "It appealed to me. I have a fondness for older pieces." "You examined it beforehand?" "Yes. Cloudy but intact. I dislike perfect things. They have no history." Slack's eyes flicked to her handbag. "And after cracked?" "I was disappointed, naturally. I don't believe in superstitions, if that is your line of inquiry. My only thought was to have it repaired." Miss Marple noticed the faintest tightening at the corners of Mrs. Blackwell's mouth. Disappointment, yes, but also something more complex. Relief again, perhaps? She made a mental note. Mr. Simpkins's last movements were reconstructed with fair clarity. He had been seen near the trestle, speaking to the schoolmaster, holding a floral china cup of tea. He had not finished it. The cup was later found on the grass, unspilled, a faint ring of moisture still clinging to its rim. Slack eyed it as if it might speak. Dr. Hayward had already taken charge of it, promising analysis in the morning. "That," said Slack in an undertone to the colonel, "will tell us more than any cracked glass." Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly together. She thought of the two types of cups in the tea tent, white and floral. Mr. Simpkins's had been floral. Was that a choice or happenstance? In her experience, such small matters could be deliberate without seeming so. The inspector was thorough with the auction layout. The trestle table stood at the center, with lots arranged in 2 rows. Behind it, a curtained section for reserve items. In front, the bidders' chairs. To the right, the tea tent. To the left, the side exit of the marquee, propped open for air. That side exit, Miss Marple noted, offered a short path to the vicarage garden, and a momentary absence from sight if one chose to slip away. Witnesses gave their accounts in turn. The schoolmaster remembered Mr. Simpkins muttering about being taken for a fool. He could not say whether this referred to the bidding or to some unrelated grievance. Mrs. Hartnell insisted she had seen a shadow pass over the mirror before it cracked, but admitted under Slack's direct stare that this might have been her own hat brim. It was Mrs. Lenton, in her quiet way, who offered the most striking observation. "I was walking past the trestle when the bidding was nearly over," she said. Mrs. Blackwell was ahead in the bidding, and Mr. Simpkins looked at her, not in anger, but in a sort of measuring way, as if he was wondering what she knew that he did not. Slack made a note. Miss Marple stored the remark alongside the image of the cracked glass, the untouched tea, the slipped lot card. By early evening, the fate had dissolved. Stalls were packed away under the supervision of church wardens, and the green began to empty. The mirror, wrapped in brown paper, had been placed in the vestry for safekeeping. pending further inspection. The villagers left in twos and threes. Their farewells weighted with curiosity. They dared not voice too loudly. Miss Marple walked home at her usual unhurried pace. The warm air scented faintly with trampled grass and melting sugar. Along the lane, she passed a Larch cottage. Yes, Mrs. Larch did have a boy who whistled. He was doing so now. Perched on the gate, his tune abrupt when she glanced his way. People's children, she reflected, often overheard more than their parents knew. At the corner, she paused to speak with young Mr. Pritchard, who was locking up the post office. He had been within earshot of the auction. "Strange business, Miss Marple," he said. "Simpkins was bidding hard for that mirror until the last minute. Odd thing. He could have outbid her. He stopped suddenly, like he'd changed his mind all at once. Perhaps he remembered a better use for his money," Miss Marple suggested gently. Maybe he knew something about the mirror. He looked, well, surprised, almost startled. She walked on, filing the remark beside the others. Surprise, sudden decision, cracked glass, and an undrunk cup of tea. People were fond of thinking murder must be plotted in grand strokes, she mused, when in reality it often rested on the smallest hinge. The second in which a hand reached under a table, the choice between two cups, the moment someone decided not to bid again. That night, Miss Marple sat by her window in the soft light of a lamp, looking out over the garden with a scent of evening stock rose in gentle waves. Somewhere in the village, Inspector Slack was no doubt arranging statements into tidy piles, thinking of fingerprints and analysis. That was all well and good. But Miss Marple, with a faint smile, thought instead of people, of Mrs. Blackwell's poised relief, of the boy's interrupted whistling, of the way Mr. Simpkins had been measuring his fellow bidder. It was too soon to say what it meant, but patterns were already forming. Faint as the first cracks in old silvering, waiting for the right light to show them clearly. Tomorrow, she thought, the village would wake with sharper appetite for answers, and she, quietly, unobtrusively, would be ready to listen. Chapter 4, Miss Marple quietly observes. Morning came to St. Mary Mead with the particular cleanness that follows a day of disturbance. The sun lifted over hedgerows washed pale by dew, and the milk cart rattled down the lane, as if to insist upon the rhythm of ordinary life. Miss Marple, who believed very much in ordinary life as the best canvas for the extraordinary, took her tea by the window and watched the sparrows quarrel in the laurel. It was a habit of hers, observing beginnings. The end of a thing is usually clear, she often reflected. It is a beginning one must learn to see. She set out rather earlier than customary, hat pinned neatly, gloves mended from the inside, so that anyone noticing the stitch would have to be both sharp-eyed and impolite. On the green, traces of the fate remained. A trampled circle, a forgotten raffle stub, a bedraggled length of bunting that the wind had wrapped round the railings like a scarf. An empty ginger beer bottle stood upright near the marquee site, accusatory as an exclamation point. Miss Marple righted the bunting and left the bottle for the churchwardens, who enjoyed such small duties. The vestry door was open. Mrs. Lenton emerged with a broom and resilience one only notices when it has been tested. She greeted Miss Marple with weary kindness. "We've kept the mirror in the vestry, Miss Marple, as Colonel Melch had asked. Inspector Slack said it was to be collected this morning." Her voice hovered carefully between propriety and curiosity. "If it is to be examined," said Miss Marple, "best that it be left untouched by wives' fingers and parish dusters." She smiled. How oddly one grows protective of things the moment they're declared important. Mrs. Lenton's eyes softened. "Last night I could not sleep for going over it. Where everyone stood, the way the light fell through the marquee crease. Useless thoughts, I'm sure." "Not at all," said Miss Marple. "Memory tidies and untidies by turns. It is good to look while the chairs are still out of their places." She glanced through the half-open door. The brown paper parcel sat on the vestry table. Beneath the paper, a shape remembered being a mirror. She did not ask to see it. Instead, she walked on, past the vicarage where the telephone was at that hour courage itself, and round by the post office. Mr. Pritchard, his cuffs freshly laundered, was putting up the day's postings with an air suggesting no tragedy should cause letters to miss their trains. He nodded, uncharacteristically subdued. Inspector Slack left early, he volunteered. Back to the station for something he called dispatch. He is a great man for dispatch. Very proper, said Miss Marple. And you, Mr. Pritchard, did you sleep? Like a lid on a biscuit tin, he said, then looked apologetic. Tight, I mean. Miss Marple purchased 2 stamps she did not require, and moved on toward the row of cottages where the hedges, untroubled by fashion, had grown into personalities. At the large cottage, the gate stood ajar, and the famous whistling boy sat upon it, not whistling. He regarded Miss Marple with the frankness of children who have learned that adults prefer to be met halfway. Good morning, said Miss Marple. I am sorry the fate ended so sadly. One feels as if a story had been interrupted before it came to the pleasant part. The boy nodded, which in his vocabulary was elaborate agreement. Mom says we're to mind our own business. But I reckon the mirror did it. Mirrors do a great many things, Miss Marple agreed gravely. They make the room bigger and show you your hat is on crooked, but they are poor at murder unless they fall from a great height. She tilted her head. You were there when the bidding was on? The boy's eyes brightened with the memory of the adult world briefly permitting his presence. I was sent for a jam spoon, he said, from Mrs. Hartnell. I went behind the table. Mr. Denham told me to mind the lots. I did. Mostly. Mostly is very good, said Miss Marple. Better than not at all. Did you find the spoon? It was under the cloth. Under where the mirror was. It was sticky. Ah, said Miss Marple, as if jam spoons naturally haunted the underside of tables. And then did you return it to Mrs. Hartnell like an honest Mercury? He considered. I gave it to the schoolmaster, he said at last, and looked surprised at his own recollection. He said he'd take it. He was talking to Mr. Simpkins. Very obliging of him, Miss Marple murmured. She thanked the boy with a tiny sweet produced from somewhere and proceeded, leaving behind a child who would now treasure jam as a confidant. At the grocer's, Miss Marple found Mrs. Price Ridley. That lady's hat was of a strictness to inspire better behavior, and she wore it like a judge passing sentence. I have always said, she announced to the room, that overexcitement comes with a modern pace. A fete now is not what it was. There's a vulgarity of novelty, theatricals and such, whereas formerly a modest tombola sufficed. It overstimulates the nerves. Nerves are impressionable, Miss Marple agreed. They take their tone from what they are fed, like certain geraniums. Mrs. Price Ridley allowed herself to be mollified by horticultural analogy. I am told, she continued more confidentially, that the mirror was donated by friends of the parish, which friends has not been made clear, and I dislike opacity. One hears it came from the old parsonage, and one hears, here she glanced as if the oranges might overhear, that the London couple were anxious to be rid of old things. Londoners are like that. New rooms do not always suit old pieces, said Miss Marple. They sulk a little. She paid for a small paper tea, which was better at the chemist's but would serve as a pretext elsewhere. Her elsewhere was the schoolhouse. The schoolmaster, Mr. Whitstable, sat at his desk with a ruler and a conscientious frown. He rose when she entered, tried to smile, and succeeded only in pulling his face into an arrangement of worry. Miss Marple, I suppose I shall be asked to give my statement again. I dare say. These things like to be repeated until the shape is agreeable, Miss Marple replied. I came, in fact, about a spoon. A spoon. For jam. She smiled. A little bird, or possibly a small boy, told me you were kind enough to rescue it during the auction. He blinked, and then recollection lit. Ah, yes, Mrs. Hartnell's. It had slipped beneath the cloth. I handed it to... Good gracious, no, I put it down, I think, when Mr. Simpkins asked me about the bidding. He wished to know the number of the lot after the mirror. He was quite precise. It was as if he were keeping tally for something beyond the price. I meant to return the spoon and forgot. Understandable, said Miss Marple. One's attention is a small thing with many claimants. And did Mr. Simpkins say why? No. He said only, after the mirror, what comes after the mirror? It sounded theatrical, but of course he meant simply the next lot. Mr. Whitstable's hand strayed to the ruler. Forgive me, it is a fidget. Fidgets are often the body's way of finishing a thought the mind is not, Miss Marple observed. You were speaking to Mr. Simpkins when he held his tea? Yes. He didn't drink. He set it down on the grass. He was cross with himself. He said, I might have known, but he did not say what. Mr. Whitstable looked at his rule, as if it might contain counsel. Inspector Slack will make something of it, I hope. Miss Marple took her leave and, as she crossed the green again, found herself intercepted by Mrs. Bantry, who possessed a happy knack of arriving wherever conversation was about to become useful. Jane, I am breathless with tidings. Charlotte Blackwell has called on the vicar's wife with flowers. Imagine! And a serenity that could float a steamer. She says she regrets the upset, of course, and adds that the mirror's damage could be rectified by a very clever man in London. She said it twice. I always distrust repeated cleverness. Repetition, Miss Marple murmured, is sometimes a paper one wraps a truth in so that it won't break into carrying. She considered. Flowers suggest either genuine feeling or strategic scent. They do soothe the room. Charlotte is not a soother, Mrs. Bantry said decisively. She is a settler of accounts. I dare say she has settled many. I have seen that look in bridge. Someone who never bids a grand slam, but goes quietly game and wins. Quiet games are often the most instructive, Miss Marple said. She patted Mrs. Bantry's arm and moved on, for she had set herself one more errand, the auctioneer's. Mr. Denham's office, a lean-to at the back of his cottage that smelled of brown paper and ink, presented a man in a state of decent agitation. He stood among catalogues, tidying what was already tidy. Miss Marple, I was about to call at the vicarage. The inspector wants my book. He tapped a ledger. Lot numbers, final bids. The Mirror is lot 34. Mrs. Blackwell at £13. He paused, then added with the air of someone noticing a familiar thing anew. Mr. Simpkins stopped at 12. He had an odd way of looking at me when he did. Not angry, no, as if he'd arrived somewhere. Some people, said Miss Marple, travel without moving. It saved the shins. She looked at the ledger. And the lot after Mirror? 35, said Denham, flipping a page. A box of household odds and ends. Small frame, a prayer book, a paperweight shaped like a lemon. Nothing of value. And its donor? He squinted. Anonymous. Friends of the parish. The vicarage cleared a cupboard, I think. Old parish gifts. We all have cupboards that oblige us to be charitable. Indeed, said Miss Marple softly. And before the Mirror? 33. A set of mismatched china cups. Floral. 6 of them. Miss Marple's eyes went very gentle, which was a look she wore when her mind was being particularly firm. Floral, she repeated. I thought as much. Thank you, Mr. Denham. She walked home by the longer path, past hedges that remembered Edwardian summers and gates that had learned the thumbprints of 3 generations. Along the way, she reviewed her morning like a knitter checking a row, the jam spoon that had strayed on a cloth, the schoolmaster's hand that had paused with it, Mr. Simpkins's odd tally, the floral cups, the question asked twice, what comes after the Mirror? And Mrs. Blackwell's careful bouquet with its doubly clever London man. Nothing yet made a picture, but the pieces had begun to recognize one another. On her doorstep she paused, listening to the village itself. The cluck of a hen, the rattle of a bicycle, the piano in a house 2 doors down stumbling patiently over scales. St. Mary Mead had a way of sounding innocent, which was a kindness and a disguise. People, Miss Marple thought, are like myrtle, sweet to sniff, but they spread where you least expect if you do not keep an eye. She made herself a light luncheon and took up her knitting at last, the needles making their comforting, reasonable talk. It was while turning a heel, a decisive little act, that she recalled, as she often did at useful moments, an old affair in Much Benham, a distant cousin who had given away a lace shawl at a church jumble because she could not bear to see it in her own house. Everyone had assumed generosity. Only later did it come out that the shawl, when it lay in a certain light, showed the pattern of a quarrel so bitter it hurt her to look at it. People rid themselves of objects for reasons that were seldom tidy. So, if the mirror came from the old parsonage, if someone wished not to see it again, if friends of the parish were a paper wrapping, if a man asked twice what followed after the mirror, and a different sort of man stopped bidding at 12 as of arriving, one must not be fanciful, of course, but one must allow for human nature, which is only fancy wearing plain shoes. In the late afternoon, Inspector Slack returned to the village with a purposeful step and the look of a man who sees the path he prefers. He called first at the vicarage, then sent notes requesting interviews. Word ran ahead of him as swiftly as gossip will run when it has a uniform to pull along. There was a suspect, people said, someone obvious enough to make the day feel sensible again. Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting, permitted herself no more than a small nod. The police, she knew, would think it simple. It very seldom was. But simplicity has its uses. It shows you who relaxes and who goes taut as a wire. She reached for her hat. It was time, she thought, to sit quietly in one or two parlors and let the next layer of talk arrange itself. The village, like a rose, always opens in stages. And when it does, there is usually a thorn where no one expected one. Chapter 5. First suspects. The police think it's simple. Inspector Slack had the look of a man who had found a path and meant to walk it quickly, whatever weeds lay in the way. By the time Miss Marple reached the vicarage gate, he was already stepping out with a brisk stride, papers in hand, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who believes a muddle is nearly sorted. Colonel Melchett followed him onto the gravel, a shade less convinced but too polite to quarrel in public. It's straightforward enough, Slack was saying, once you strip away all the village embroidery, opportunity, motive, and the object at hand. Not much else to it. Miss Marple, who had a deep respect for embroidery as both art and metaphor, waited until men were near before greeting them. Good afternoon, Colonel. Inspector, you look as if you've had a productive morning. Slack gave a short nod. We have Mrs. Blackwell's our person of interest. Miss Marple raised her brows with mild surprise, the kind that invites further explanation without actually challenging it. She was bidding for the mirror, Slack went on, which turns out to have been the centerpiece in some long-standing grievance between her and the deceased. They knew each other before she came to the village. Business in London, of all things. There was a disagreement over property, from what I gather. Simpkins got the better of her, or she thought he did. He turns up here. She sees her chance to get her own back, if not through the bidding, then by other means. And the means? Asked Miss Marple gently. Poison, Slack said without hesitation. We've had the first word from the lab. Traces in his tea. Not in the urn, mind, but in the cup. The floral sort. Miss Marple inclined her head. That to seem focused. Exactly, said Slack. She had opportunity, before the auction, to slip something into the cup. She handled it. Mrs. Bantry says she saw her pass the tea along in the tent. Mrs. Blackwell claims she only carried it from the table to where Simpkins was standing. A small walk, enough for a drop or two. And it's not hard to get hold of the stuff. Not if you know where to look. Melchett cleared his throat. It's not all neat yet. There's no evidence she purchased any such poison, and no one recalls her visiting a chemist in the last month. Slack dismissed this with a wave. It's the sort of thing one can pick up in other ways, left over in a shed from an old house. She's a collector of antiques, plenty of cleaning agents, and the like about. Miss Marple, who had seen many simple answers unravel like cheap knitting, merely observed, It is a fortunate thing, Inspector, that cups and mirrors cannot speak. The conversations they must overhear. Slack gave her a look that was not quite amused. You think it's more complicated. I think, said Miss Marple, that people rarely do the thing that would be most obvious to a policeman. Human nature is fond of detours. The inspector left to take Mrs. Blackwell into informal questioning at the station. Melchett lingered, clearly weighing the merits of inviting Miss Marple's thoughts now versus later. He opted for later, muttering something about not muddying the waters until Slack had had his swim. Miss Marple strolled on, making no direct path home. Instead, she found herself at Mrs. Bantry's, where the lady of the house greeted her with the frank delight of someone who has news and an audience. Jane, I knew it, Charlotte Blackwell. I said so yesterday, didn't I? That woman has the air of someone who's finished a job and is just waiting for the ink to dry. They say she's gone off with Slack in his car. Quite composed, of course. I dare say she's already planning her defense. And what form do you imagine that will take? Oh, something quiet and dignified. She'll say she didn't know the man was drinking from that cup, that anyone could have picked it up, which, in fairness, is true. I took a sip from the wrong cup myself once at bridge. Dreadful experience, I assure you. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, cups do tend to wander when no one is watching. Over tea, poured from Mrs. Bantry's own pot, which never left her side. Miss Marple listened as her friend described the seating in the tent, the line of sight from the cake stall, and the curious fact that the schoolmaster had been hovering near Simpkins and Blackwell during the bidding. Hovering can be useful, Miss Marple murmured. One may see more from a shadow than from a spotlight. When she left, she walked through the high street. The schoolmaster was at his gate, tying back a climbing rose. He straightened when she paused. I hear, Miss Marple said pleasantly, that Mrs. Blackwell has gone to speak with the inspector. Yes, he replied, his tone careful. It's not my place to comment, but I suppose it's always simpler if there's someone obvious. Simple, said Miss Marple, is a comfortable word, but not always a safe one. Did you see her near the cups? I saw her pass one to Simpkins. That's all. I didn't think anything of it. Miss Marple looked at the rose stem in his hand. And yet, roses have thorns, even when they appear tame. She nodded and went on. By the time she reached home, the summer light was softening toward evening. She sat at her writing desk, though she had no letter to compose, and thought instead of all the moments between the pouring of tea and the bidding for the mirror, the jam spoon on the table, the question about what comes after the mirror, the boys' interrupted whistling, the floral cups, 6 of them, and the fact that the poison one had found its way to Mr. Simpkins at all. Mrs. Blackwell was a convenient suspect, yes, but Miss Marple knew convenience and detection was like a buttered scone. It might look perfect until you found the currents uneven. She had seen too many tidy cases untied by a single overlooked thread, and she had the distinct feeling that this case, far from being neatly knotted, had threads running into more than one pair of hands. The village, she knew, would sleep easier tonight believing the matter nearly solved. But Miss Marple, as she poured herself a final cup of tea, suspected that morning would bring with it a fresh ripple of trouble that would not sit quietly in Inspector Slack's neat bundle. Chapter 6. A hidden clue, overlooked but vital. By the following morning the village had obligingly resumed its routines, as if tidiness of habit could be a moral disinfectant. Yet St. Mary Mead carried a tautness beneath its smile, the way a freshly made bed hides the crease of a sleepless night. Miss Marple, who trusted routine without believing in it, tied on her apron and walked to the church hall with a small basket and the expression of a woman who means to be helpful about the washing up. Mrs. Lenton, grateful for hands and gentleness, had arranged the tea things on long draining boards. We've left the floral cups aside, she told Miss Marple, in case the inspector wants them again. He sent word not to touch the one Dr. Hayward removed yesterday. Naturally, said Miss Marple, her gaze falling on 2 stacks. The plain white set the parish use for Mother's meeting, and the 6 floral cups, prettily mismatched, that had lent the fate an illusion of elegance. 5 floral cups nested together, their rims small crescents of faded roses. The 6th stood solitary on the board, its saucer askew beneath it, as if it preferred not to keep company. Miss Marple took up a cloth, and, because people rarely mind if an old lady straightens things, she separated the 5 that matched and lifted the 6th to the light. The pattern on this one was almost the same, and yet not. The roses ran in a thinner chain, and a leaf etched near the handle had the faintest blur, as though the transfer had slipped a hair's breadth during firing. On the base, where the glaze had crazed delicately, a smudge of soft pencil made a timid little hieroglyph. Such a sweet set, Mrs. Lenton said, coming up with a tray. We found them last year in the parish cupboard. Mrs. Hartnell insisted we use them for best. Very right, Miss Marple murmured. 5 for best. She turned the odd cup neatly in her hand. The smudge resolved itself into two characters that had not quite yielded to washing. 33. She set it down and looked at the saucer. The saucer did not belong to it. Its rim was a whisper larger, and when she tapped it with her nail, it gave a deeper note than its fellows. A cup and saucer may marry across households, Miss Marple thought, but they seldom speak the same language. "May I have a look in the cupboard?" she asked. "I have a fancy we will find something there that has Mrs. Partner." "Of course," said Mrs. Lenton, puzzled but obliging. Inside the tall parish cupboard, where every fate since 1908 seemed to have left a polite footprint, stood a row of saucers. 5 floral saucers matched the 5 floral cups. A 6th saucer the same set sat slightly askew, edged by a fine nick that had been carefully turned toward the back. There was no saucer to match the odd cup. On the shelf below, stacked neatly, lay the cardboard remnants of the auction, string, labels, and a handful of numbered lot cards. One, abashed at not having been tidy with its fellows, had settled behind a tin for candles. Miss Marple coaxed it out. Its corner wore a smudge like the one she had seen on the cup. 33. "We did have a muddle with tags," Mrs. Lenton confessed. "Mr. Denham said it happens when one is both selling and pouring tea." "It does," said Miss Marple, very gently. She replaced the card and closed the cupboard. "It does indeed." She washed the 5 matching cups with schoolgirl obedience and left the stranger to its reflections. On her way out, she paused at the vestry, where the brown paper parcel, mirror within, rested on the table like a guest who had decided to stay. The paper had acquired 2 small punctures near one corner. Not tears, rather the neat, twin dimples of a string that had been tied and then retied by a different pair of hands. It was a domestic observation, of no consequence to anyone who had not spent a lifetime reusing brown paper. Outside, in the dapple under the yew, a figure moved and halted. The schoolmaster. He had the mild startlement of a man encountered in a thought he meant to do standing up. "Miss Marple," he said, came to inquire whether the inspector had returned to him lists he borrowed. But of course it can wait." "Everything waits," Miss Marple replied, "until it does not." She smiled, friendly as sunshine, and watched the small pause before he excused himself. Too small for guilt, perhaps, but just the size of an untidy memory. She turned down the path toward the vicarage garden, taking the long way to the gate. It afforded her a glance at the patch of grass where the auction table had stood. The ground still bore a flattened, green-gray shadow of trestle legs. Near it lay a dry fleck the size of a barley corn, dark and glossy. Miss Marple knelt. Old knees complained, but they served, and teased it with the tip of a pen. Jam, long since turned to lacquer by air and sun. Jam beneath the place where the mirror had stood, just where a small boy might fumble a spoon under cloth. She had no truck with melodrama. Jam was only jam. But jam on a cloth that lay before a row of lots with their little paper labels. Jam on fingers that might then touch cups. Jam that could be a pretext for hands behind a table. Life, Miss Marple knew, produces pretexts by the dozen. It is the use one makes of them that turns a day. At the gate she met Mr. Denham, his ledger under his arm like a shield. "Inspector Slack has had me up since 8, he exclaimed, flushing. "Questions, Miss Marple. He's a man who tidies by shoving everything into one box." "Boxes have their virtue," she said, "but I have always found that keeping the lids properly matched to the bottoms prevents accidents." He looked at her, baffled, then rallied. "We a small muddle with lot cards yesterday," he admitted. "Fell off the frame of the mirror when I moved it. I picked one from the floor. It must have been the cup's card, 33, and stuck it on the nearer thing to hand until I could set it right. Some silly little frame in the odds and ends. I corrected it before the bidding." He frowned. "At least, I think I did." "What comes after the mirror?" Miss Marple repeated softly, as if asking a child to recite a lesson. "Beg pardon?" Only a line that stuck. She thanked him and went on. Her next call was not on the inspector, but on Mrs. Blackwell. The newcomer's cottage, set a street back from the high road, had the faint bareness of a room recently moved into by someone who keeps her possessions in tidy ranks. Mrs. Blackwell let Miss Marple in with an economy of words and ushered her to a chair that had clearly been placed with visitors in mind. "I shall be quiet," Miss Marple said. "I know you have had a very fatiguing morning." "Inspector Slack has a very clear idea of me," Mrs. Blackwell replied. She folded her hands, capable, ringless, and allowed herself a tired smile that almost became a grimace. "He knows exactly how I did everything I didn't do. Clarity of that sort," Miss Marple suggested, "is a thing one has to dust constantly or it gets hazy." She glanced about the room. On the mantel stood a modest array, a clock, a pair of candlesticks, and, tucked almost bashfully to one side, a small lemon-colored paperweight glass with a bubble like a seed trapped in its heart. "A charming trifle," Miss Marple observed. "It came among a lot I bought in London," said Mrs. Blackwell. "Odds and ends." She paused. "I suppose you two are here to decide if I am the sort of woman who poisons cups." "I am here," Miss Marple said, "to ask whether you like your tea in floral cups." Mrs. Blackwell gave the smallest of laughs. "I like my tea to taste of tea. The village makes it taste of conversation." Then, after a moment, "I carried a cup yesterday, yes. The tent was short of hands. I passed one to Mr. Simpkins because he looked odd, somehow, as if he'd gone somewhere unpleasant in his head. You have seen people do that. He hardly noticed me." "People often don't," Miss Marple said gently. On leaving, she did not go to the police station. She turned instead into the post office, where Mr. Pritchard had arranged a new strip of stamps with reverence. "A parcel for you, Miss Marple, forwarded from a niece," he said, delighted to be serviceable. Then, lowering his voice, "The inspector's been asking who handled the cups. He's got a list." "Lists are very soothing," said Miss Marple. "They make one feel all the pieces are in the same drawer." She carried her niece's parcel home and, in the quiet of her sitting room, added her own list to the village's many. She did not write names. She wrote small things. 33 on base of cup. Odd saucer. Jam fleck near trestle. Brown paper retied. What comes after the mirror? Schoolmaster with the hymn lists. Lemon paperweight. And, because she believed in confessionals of the ordinary, she added, Mrs. Blackwell, relief. Once written, the little things became more themselves. The cup marked 33 suggested the auction lot. The floral set of the tea tent, with its 5 matching sisters, had been supplemented by a 6th from elsewhere. Someone had borrowed, substituted. One could mark a cup in pencil and wash most of the way. A trace would linger, enough for an eye that knew where to look. And cups wander, as Mrs. Bantry had said. They wander more obligingly when a helpful hand straightens saucers and offers to pass one along. Miss Marple pressed her fingers together until they shaped a steeple. There were 2 movements visible beneath the surface of the day. The obvious one in which a poised woman carried poison to a man she disliked, and a quieter one in which the geography of cups, cards, and small domestic tidying had been arranged so that the obvious would be seen. The first was the story the village could tell at tea. The second, she suspected, belonged to someone who knew exactly how much people trust the prettiness of a floral rim. Her bell rang, and she rose, expecting a neighbor with eggs. It was Inspector Slack. He stood squarely on her mat, patience and impatience sharing the same face. "Miss Marple," he said, "I'm told you've been at the hall, ferreting among the crockery. One cannot help seeing things when they are left out," she returned mildly. "We've enough without villagers making patterns where there aren't any. We have a witness that Mrs. Blackwell handed Simpkins the cup he held. We have residue on it. We have motive. And yet," said Miss Marple very softly, "you do not have the cup's origin." Slack's eyes narrowed, and for a heartbeat his hand tightened on his notebook. He recovered almost at once. "The origin of a teacup is parish property." "The origin of that teacup," Miss Marple said, "is lot 33. For the first time she saw him look, not flustered, never that, but momentarily bald with certainty, like a man who has taken off his hat and remembered too late that he is not on his own doorstep. He weighed her a second, then put his hat back on in spirit. "Be careful, Miss Marple," he said, not unkindly. "People who notice too much sometimes find trouble notices them back." "It has very good eyesight," Miss Marple agreed. She smiled. "But we mustn't deprive it, must we?" When he had gone, the room retained a small draft of his disapproval. Miss Marple sat again, patient as an embroidery hoop. The cup marked 33 had not gone unnoticed by the one who placed it, either. Somewhere in the village a pair of hands knew that an old woman had touched the thread at last. And hands, when their work is nearly done, do not like to feel a tug. Chapter 7. Confrontations and Secrets. By the following day, the village had taken on that strained brightness one sees in a parlor where an awkward conversation has just occurred. Curtains drawn back, windows polished, but the air faintly taut. The fate was already spoken of in the past tense, yet every retelling seemed to sharpen rather than fade its details. And with Inspector Slack's attention fixed upon Mrs. Blackwell, the rest of St. Mary Mead had begun to look sideways at one another. Not always for the reasons the inspector might think. Miss Marple, on her way to the grocer's, passed the vicarage and caught sight of Mrs. Lenton in brisk conversation with Mrs. Price Ridley. They were speaking in those quick, polite tones that suggest one is rehearsing a version of events for public use. When they noticed Miss Marple, both fell into warmer civility. "Such a dreadful business, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price Ridley declared. "And to think, in our own quiet village. I am only glad the inspector is acting promptly. If only all crimes could be as neatly managed." Miss Marple nodded. "Neatness can be a comfort, though one must be certain the corners aren't turned in too quickly." Mrs. Lenton's eyes flickered. "You think there's more to it?" "Oh, I think there's always more to anything," Miss Marple replied gently. "The question is whether it matters." She smiled her way onward, leaving the two women to exchange a glance that was more wary than gossipy. At the grocer's she found Mr. Pritchard, the sub-postmaster, lingering by the window of Tin Goods. He greeted her with a hesitant look, as if uncertain whether he wished to speak. But Mr. Pritchard was a man who disliked keeping things to himself. "You didn't hear it from me," he began, lowering his voice, "but Mrs. Blackwell wasn't the only one near that tea table. I saw the schoolmaster, Mr. Whitstable, pick up a floral cup just before the auction, wipe the rim with his thumb as if checking for a chip. Then he put it down again." Miss Marple gave the smallest nod. A thoughtful man, perhaps wanted to make sure it was fit for use. "Perhaps," Pritchard said, unconvinced. But when the inspector asked him about it later, he said he'd been nowhere near the table until after Simpkins had his tea. "People sometimes forget," Miss Marple said mildly, "that small acts are as memorable as large ones, if someone is looking." From the grocer's she walked toward the green, where preparations were underway to dismantle the last of the fate marquees. Mr. Denham, the auctioneer, stood with a clipboard, his mood less tidy than his ledger. "It's the talk," he said in frustration when Miss Marple paused to greet him. "Not just about Mrs. Blackwell, though that's the main dish. There's muttering about how the old parsonage was sold, and whether Simpkins did right by the village. I've even heard it said he held back items that ought to have gone to parish use. That can be a sore point," Miss Marple said. "Things people expect to be shared have a way of becoming more valuable in memory." Denham's jaw tightened. "And if you want my opinion, there's more than one person here who'd have preferred certain items never came to light." As if to prove his point, they were interrupted by Mrs. Hartnell, her face flushed with a mixture of indignation and enjoyment. "Mr. Denham, I will thank you to tell the inspector that my name is being bandied about most unjustly. I never went near the auction lots except to admire the mirror, before it was damaged, and if I did borrow the parish jam spoon, it was in the course of service to the church." "I don't think the inspector is concerned about spoons, Mrs. Hartnell," Denham said with forced calm. Miss Marple's eyes rested on Mrs. Hartnell's gloved hands. Gloves in August were a decoration. "A spoon is a curious thing," she said mildly. "It passes easily from one hand to another without much notice. One might almost forget who last held it." Mrs. Hartnell hesitated, then bristled. "I returned it at once to the tent, if that's your meaning. Now, if you will excuse me." She swept off toward the vicarage, her composure slightly frayed. By early afternoon, Miss Marple had heard 3 more such small protests from different quarters. each denying some minor involvement that no one had publicly accused them of. The village was beginning to turn inward, each resident eyeing their own movements for anything that might, under scrutiny, look like a guilty step. That evening, Miss Marple was invited to take tea at Mrs. Bantry's, who could never resist an opportunity to hold court in the drawing room when the air was thick with speculation. "I'll tell you something, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, leaning forward with relish. "This business has flushed out more old quarrels than I knew we had. That vicarage cupboard, for instance. Do you know half the parish property was given years ago by people who later fell out with one another? The cups were a gift from Mrs. Larch's late aunt, and Mrs. Hartnell never forgave her for winning the flower show 2 years running. People do like their victories unmarred," Miss Marple observed. "And as for that paperweight, lemon-colored, very distinctive, it was once part of the old parsonage's study. I remember seeing it there before the sale, and now it's on Mrs. Blackwell's mantel." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for a fraction of a second. "Ah," she said softly. "Objects travel, Mrs. Bantry, often along the same routes as gossip." Mrs. Bantry was too caught up in her catalog of local rivalries to notice the significance. It's a wonder the inspector doesn't simply ask about every quarrel in the last 5 years and be done with it. Miss Marple smiled faintly, perhaps because quarrels, unlike crimes, are rarely finished when they are done. When she left, the street was dusking into that soft lavender light that seems to muffle sound. She passed the schoolmaster's house and noticed him standing in the doorway, speaking low to a man she did not immediately recognize, a man in work clothes, with the weathered look of someone from the outlying farms. They both stopped speaking when they saw her. "Good evening, Miss Marple," Mr. Whitstable said, his voice a fraction too bright. "Just discussing the fate arrangements." "How sensible," Miss Marple said with a mildness that made no comment at all. Arrangements are often most interesting after the event. They wished her good night, but she had already placed a moment beside the others in her mind. The denials offered too quickly. The small items moved and mismatched, the jam spoon that had wandered under the table, and the parish property that had found new homes without a word. The village might be willing to see Mrs. Blackwell take the brunt of the inspector's certainty, but Miss Marple knew when a story was being tidied to fit a single frame, and when stories were tidied too much, it was usually to conceal the pattern of the stitching underneath. Some stitches, she thought as she reached her gate, were beginning to pull, and when they did, whatever was being held together would show itself, whether the village liked it or not. Chapter 8. Another twist, a second crime. Evening settled upon St. Mary Mead with that demure modesty English villages cultivate after scandal, as if a careful dusk could teach the day to behave. Lamps flickered on. Curtains were drawn and doors fastened with the tiny, reassuring rituals of bolts that had never before seemed necessary. The talk in parlors had turned from what happened to what will happen next, which is always the point at which what happens next obligingly obliges. Miss Marple, after a small supper and a few quietly decisive rows of stocking stitch, set her teacup down at the exact moment the vicarage bell began to peal in an agitated, half-stifled way, one of those urgent rings that belong more to human hands than to brass and rope. In the lane, a churchwarden hurried past like a man sent for a doctor who has not yet decided which ailment he is fetching him for. Within 10 minutes, Colonel Melchett was at Miss Marple's gate, hat in hand, apology in his eyes. "You'll forgive the hour, Miss Marple. Something at the church. A break-in, we think. The vestry." "Dear me," said Miss Marple, rising at once. "People are so modern about their sins nowadays. One used to wait until Sunday." They crossed in brisk silence. At the churchyard, the yews held the last light as if reluctant to let it go. The vestry door stood open, its latch splintered with a rudeness that made Miss Marple wince on behalf of good wood. Inside, the scene had the look of a cupboard turned out in a hurry. A drawer gaped, hymnless lay fanned like lost feathers, and on the center table the brown paper parcel, yesterday's mirror, had been worried open and then retied with a different haste. The string's ends were unequal. There are people, Miss Marple reflected, who cannot tie a parcel without revealing something of their souls. "Caught denim here," Inspector Slack said curtly. He stood square as a lectern, impatience arranged upon him like a decent coat. He heard a rattle, when he passed and came in to see. Something or someone knocked him down. Clipped him from behind when he stepped through the door. He'll have a great egg of a bruise, but nothing broken. Our man had flown by the time Denham got his wits about him. Flown, and yet had time to retie a parcel, Miss Marple observed mildly, examining the knot with fingertip. That is either politeness or panic. Slack grunted. Or show. There's more. The box of odds and ends, lot 35, has been riffled. Frames backing prize away and left. Prayer book gone. Paperweight gone. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the side table. There lay the little frame, its thin cardboard back clumsily torn, and a pinch of old dust scattered like snuff. The prayer book's absence registered only as a small rectangle of undusted wood where it had lain earlier. She imagined the paperweight, lemon glass with a bubble caught inside. She had seen its twin, or perhaps itself, on Mrs. Blackwell's mantel. Lot 35, she repeated softly. What comes after the mirror? Melchett. Quick though he was, gave her a sideways look. You think there's significance in the sequence? I think, Miss Marple said, that someone did. Slack gestured at the window, where a pane had been neatly lifted from the putty and set on the sill like a tray, in and out without much noise. A bit of competence, I'll grant him that. Denham says he noticed a vestry light, and came to douse it. He's sure he saw a shadow cross the glass. The only prints on the pane are smudged. The only good ones belong to Denham and to the vicar, who put the pane back to keep the draft off the organ. Slack's mouth tightened at that. Villagers tidy first and tell you after. Miss Marple bent over the frame. If one were looking for a document hidden in a picture back, she said, one would leave the picture. The back is a point. It is very rarely the front that tells the truth. Quite like people. Hidden document, Slack repeated neutrally, though in a tone that said he had thought of it and disliked that anyone else had. We'll ask Denham, who bought lot 35. He insists he delivered it here after the auction for collection. There's confusion about who paid. Some late settling of accounts for parish goods. That box, in particular, seems to have been everyone's and nobody's. I've half a mind to think our thief didn't want the paperweight. Just anything that might hide something flat inside. The prayer book would oblige, Miss Marple said. People have tucked away more secrets in good leather than in safes, though a paperweight can hold down a note as effectively as it holds down papers. Footsteps sounded hastily in the passage, and Mr. Denham appeared, pale, his voice abashed by its own importance. I'm that sorry, Inspector. I never should have gone alone. Saw the light and thought, draft again, and, well, something had moved. I could tell by the ledger on the sill. The next thing I know, someone shouldered me. Felt more like a shove than a blow. I went sprawling and cracked my head on the wainscot. Describe to someone. Slack snapped. Quick, Denham said miserably. Low to the ground. No, that's wrong. Not low. Light, she, went past like a whippet. There was a scent. Something sharp. Lavender, maybe. My mother liked lavender. Half the village likes lavender, Slack muttered, making a note that would later annoy him by its uselessness. Miss Marple had wandered to the parcel. She lifted the knot away a little, only enough to note the change in the paper beneath. The first set of string dimples she had seen yesterday were still there. The second set pressed elsewhere, skew, between them, where the paper had been retied. A finger had left a faint print in flowery dust. Parish cupboards made one a present of their past. Drawers share their talc and beeswax. She did not touch it. She was not Slack, to be feared. She was Miss Marple, to be overlooked. Why the mirror? Melchett asked, frowning. If the target was lot 35, why touch the mirror parcel at all? Because one cannot help it, Miss Marple said, unexpected compassion in her tone. If you are the sort of person who cannot leave a box closed, you are also the sort who peeps under paper. And if you are not that sort, you might wish to make it seem as though you were, to muddle the point. Either way, the hand goes where the mind is already traveling. Slack straightened. Enough poeticisms. We'll set a constable at the vestry and go through Denham's book line by line. I want names for every hand that touched 35. And I want to know why exactly Simpkins asked about it. If he did. He did, Miss Marple said softly. The schoolmaster heard him. At that, Slack's eyebrows performed their small, economical conversation. Whitstable heard a lot, apparently. He can tell me about it again, under caution if necessary. They parted at the church door, Slack with his constable in tow, Melchett to fetch keys and statements. Miss Marple with a mind as tidy as a sewing box that nevertheless knows there is one missing thimble. On her way home she took, not by accident, the lane that passed the schoolhouse. A dim lamplight glowed in the front room. Mr. Whitstable sat at a table with papers spread before him in earnest disorder. He rose as she appeared in the doorway. Miss Marple, he said, with a heaviness that had not been there in daylight. They've told me about the vestry. I've just been, ordering my notes for the inspector. I fear my memory isn't what one wishes it to be when it is wanted. His smile attempted apology and achieved distress. Memory, Miss Marple said, likes to be coaxed as one coaxes a cat, never by chasing it. Her eyes, at cat height, noticed a neat, square indentation in the schoolroom blotter where something small and heavy had sat long enough to teach the paper a lesson. The indentation was round at one corner, as if from a polished base. Lemon glass would do it. So would a brass inkwell. She did not pursue the thought, because pursuing thoughts too loudly startles them. "Do you ever hide things in old books, Mr. Whitstable?" she asked, as if the idea amused her. He actually laughed. "Only exam answers for myself, Miss Marple." "Very proper," she said, and let him keep his laugh. By the time she reached her own gate, a boy's whistle trilled, the larch child late and fearless. The tune went out on a sudden hiccup as he saw Inspector Slack striding toward the post office. Slack stopped him, spoke a moment, something brief and official, and the boy pointed not at the church, but down toward the lane that led to the old parsonage. The gesture was a small stone dropped in a well. Miss Marple heard the splash far below. She slept lightly. In the morning, the village woke to the newness of a second wrong. The vestry break-in made the first crime feel less like a freak accident and more like the beginning of a list. Lists are soothing until they lengthen. Mr. Pritchard told anyone with stamps that a note had come for Inspector Slack by the early post. No address, only the words, penned in a tidy hand. What follows the mirror is what was always behind it. He had, of course, read it by holding it up to the light. Human nature being consistent in small treacheries. At breakfast, Mrs. Bantry telephoned Miss Marple with the gusto of a woman whose curiosity had been paid interest. "My dear, the vicar says the prayer book that's missing has R.S. in gilt on the flyleaf. Rachel Simpkins, the sister who died 10 years ago. Can you imagine? That box of odds and ends was practically the Simpkins family's attic. Then someone, Miss Marple said, is tidying up the past with a dustpan, which is only ever half a job." She set down the receiver and looked at her own list. 33 on cup, odd saucer, jam fleck, retied paper, lemon paperweight, prayer book gone. What comes after the mirror? And now the note with its nursery rhyme riddle. Behind a mirror, in any decent household, one finds dust hooks and old nail holes. In a less decent one finds letters tucked between backing and glass. It was not merely that there had been a second crime. It was that the second had announced the first was part of a pattern. And patterns, once they declare themselves, begin to link people who would rather not be linked. As Miss Marple pinned her hat, she thought of Mrs. Blackwell's relief, of the schoolmaster's neat lamplight, of Denham's practiced hands, of the vicarage cupboards with their parish lives, and of the old parsonage, whose new owners had not yet learned that houses are no more easily rid of their tempers than people. There would be more talk today and less comfort in it. There would be denials and then quarrels. And in the small, telling spaces between them, Miss Marple meant to listen for the thing the village always tells you if you're very quiet, who cannot bear for something to be found. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The web of lies deepens. Morning found St. Mary Mead with its laces straightened and its temper uncertain. The vestry break-in had taken the village from shocked recital into a sort of collective rehearsal. Everyone seemed to be arranging versions of themselves to present to Inspector Slack. It made for a cheerful bustle which, like most cheerful bustles, had a nervous undertow. Miss Marple, who preferred to begin where other people had tidied, walked first to the vicarage. The prayer book, the vanished one, was the object of her errand, though she asked for nothing so direct. In the vicar's little study, where the window yielded shyly to the morning, Mrs. Lenton had laid out a stack of parish registers for a task that pretended to be about dates and was in fact about memory. Rachel Simpkins, Miss Marple said, hands folded, as if reciting a hymn. R.S. in guilt. She died 10 years ago. Of a fever, quite sudden, Mrs. Lenton replied. Her brother saw to everything. The prayer book was part of a Sunday school bequest, a set of Bibles and some hymnals. The little box of odds and ends, well, that was sent over later, when the parsonage was being cleared before the sale. Sent by whom? Mrs. Lenton glanced at the vicar, who consulted a list with the air of a man hoping to gain certainty by peering hard. It says friends of the parish, I'm afraid, he admitted, which usually means no one particularly wishes to be mentioned. People are so modest when it is convenient, Miss Marple murmured. And the Simpkins family, was there more than the brother and a late sister? A nephew somewhere gone abroad, the vicar said vaguely, and some cousinry. One loses track of branches when they don't come at Christmas. Miss Marple thanked them and went on. The path from the vicarage to the old parsonage had the thoughtful quality of places that have recently changed their minds. The London couple, Mr. and Mrs. Granger, had been seen scarcely at all since the fete. They were said to be resting from the country. Miss Marple, whose manner had a way of unlocking careful doors, met Mrs. Granger at the gate and was received, not effusively, but with a kind of urban politeness that is grateful to be told what to do. We had no notion, Mrs. Granger said, beautiful and brittle as a good cup, that our old mirror would become such a, what is the word, symbol. We sent it along for the auction only because my husband found it unsettling, and the corridor is narrow. She smiled, almost pleadingly. You know how one comes to feel about an object that catches one in the wrong light. Oh, indeed, Miss Marple said. One sometimes falls out with chair. The old parsonage smelled faintly of fresh paint and the obstinate memory of coal fires. Mrs. Granger showed Miss Marple the bare place where the mirror had hung. Hooks remained old and persuasive. The builder said the backing had been altered long ago, she confessed. One of those makeshift repairs. When we took it down the first time, a little dust and a slip of card fell. Quite perished. My husband threw it away. I told Inspector Slack. He made a noise that suggested I ought not to have. I dare say he is right. A slip of card, Miss Marple repeated. With writing? Only the number RS in pencil and some smudge of a date. I thought it the sort of thing one pins behind frames to help with inventories. She hesitated. The paperweight is gone too, you've heard? It belonged to the study. The previous owner, a Mr. Simpkins, left a note saying certain small objects with no obvious pedigree might be disposed of for parish benefit. We were very dutiful. She attempted a light laugh and then looked unhappy. Mr. Simpkins called twice during the handover. He was, how shall I say, firm. I dislike firm men. Firmness can be merely the nerves in disguise, Miss Marple said. I am obliged to you, Mrs. Granger. You've been most clear. On the path back, she met the large boy keeping company with his whistle again, this time subdued, as if sound might overstep. He hopped off the gate when she paused and scuffed a heel into the dust. Mum says I'm not to talk about the church, he began in the tone of one about to do exactly that. But I saw the man running. Did you, dear? Miss Marple's voice made no more of it than of a sparrow. Running where? Down by the parsonage hedge. Short cut to the lane. He had a parcel. I know. Casa stringtails were bouncing. And he didn't look back, not once. Brave, or very busy, Miss Marple said. A scent, perhaps? Lavender. He wrinkled his nose. Soap, the cheap kind. My uncle uses it. He thought, then added with triumph. And chalk. He smelled of chalk. Schoolmaster chalk? Miss Marple suggested, as if chalk smelt only one way. He grinned, pleased with a riddle answered. Like that. Miss Marple gave him a sweet and a smile that said nothing. Chalk belonged to many hands, and she did not favor the neat stories that villagers prefer at tea. Still, she set the chalk beside the lemon paperweight, the note behind the mirror, and the question always turning, "What comes after the mirror?" At the post office, Mr. Pritchard arranged his face into the respectful blankness of a man who knows a story and fears to be asked. He failed nobly. "If anyone should inquire, Miss Marple," he said in a whisper that went round the shop like a draft, "I didn't hand an anonymous note to the inspector until I'd made a copy. I do not approve of secrecy, but I detest ill-phrased riddles." "You are a public servant," Miss Marple said approvingly. "We must all do our bit. Also," Pritchard added, "the schoolmaster sent a telegram yesterday afternoon to London. Same name as the auctioneer's dealer there. Man who values small objects. Address in Holborn." "How industrious," Miss Marple observed. "A man cannot bear to sleep upon a question, perhaps." She left Pritchard, who glowed with usefulness, and found herself, by one of those accidents that occur where intention and habit meet, outside Mrs. Blackwell's cottage. The newcomer opened at once, as if she had expected exactly this knock and had decided to receive it with unflurried frankness. "They say," Mrs. Blackwell began without preface, "that I am the simplest path. I am very seldom that in life. It vexes people." "It comforts some," Miss Marple allowed. "Comfort is a lazy housemaid. One mustn't let her run the stairs." Mrs. Blackwell permitted herself the ghost of a smile. "Inspector Slack has asked me about London, until London sounds like a lie I have invented. I knew Rachel Simpkins, slightly. We worked on a charity committee, very dull, very worthy. She had kind hands and a sharp way of finishing a task. Her brother disliked me. He disliked most women who did not require him. He saw me once with a man outside the committee rooms. He assumed an affair. It was my brother, who had just lost his situation." She looked at Miss Marple levelly. "Mr. Simpkins was not a good man, though he seemed an efficient one." "Goodness and efficiency sit rather awkwardly together," Miss Marple said. "They argue over who shall hold the pen." Mrs. Blackwell's gaze moved just once to the mantel where the lemon paperweight had lately sat. Today a small porcelain dog occupied the spot. "Since you asked with your eyes, Miss Marple," she said, "the paperweight is gone. Inspector Slack took it to compare with the missing one, and I am to prove how I came by mine. I could, but proof is a thing men choose to see or not." "I have known that," Miss Marple said. "May I offer a small comfort? Proof is less important than pattern. When a pattern is shown, even men begin to see." From Mrs. Blackwell she walked toward the schoolhouse. Mr. Whitstable received her in the doorway with that careful, gentle politeness of a man who suspects he is being measured for a suit he did not order. "You have been busy," Miss Marple said mildly. "Only tidying my thoughts," he answered, too quickly. "The inspector prefers them tidy. Tidiness is a virtue like silence. Both are put on and taken off." She looked past him into the room. Papers, arranged in squared-off stacks, occupied the table. A little line of white dust, chalk, ran along the top edge of one pile, as if a sleeve had brushed it. By the window, the blotter kept its square indentation. "Mr. Whitstable," she said, and allowed the name to be a kindness. "Did you help Mr. Simpkins with the cataloguing at the old parsonage before the sale?" He colored slightly. "Only as a neighborly act. He asked me to list titles from the study. He disliked musty rooms. I prepared a simple inventory and delivered it to his office. It was nothing." "Nothing is often an ingredient in something," Miss Marple replied. "And the mirror, did you ever see it down? To dust the hooks, eh?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Once. There was a card behind it with initials, R.S. and a date. I mentioned it to Simpkins. He said it was one of his sister's fads, labeling everything like a housemaid." He laughed. Mr. Whitstable's mouth made a straight, unhappy line. He laughed at many things. I did not always find him amusing. "Few men who enjoy laughter enjoy it kindly," Miss Marple said. "Thank you." By afternoon the village had learned two things it had not known at breakfast, and misunderstood both: that the prayer book had been Rachel's, and that someone had run from a vestry by the parsonage hedge. The first fact became, in one drawing room, proof of sorrow, in another, proof of spite. The second became, by tea, a male figure with a limp, and by supper, a woman in a dark coat, though no one could say which they had seen. St. Marymead seldom allowed a fact to wander about without companions. Miss Marple and the Mirror that Cracked on Its Own. Chapter 1. A pleasant day turned grim. The morning of the St. Mildred summer fete dawned with that rare sort of perfection that could make even the most cynical of St. Marymead's residents remark upon the weather. The air was mild, the roses along the churchyard wall drooped with scented heaviness, and the bunting, faded from years of service, fluttered with polite enthusiasm in the breeze. Miss Jane Marple, in her pale blue straw hat with the ribbon she had sewn on herself the night before, strolled along the gravel path toward the green. She had already stopped to admire Mrs. Bantry's delphiniums, which she had to admit were looking rather fine this year, though Mrs. Bantry was quick to attribute their health to a new proprietary feed one simply must try. The fete was one of those occasions that seemed unchanging from year to year. The cake stall run by Mrs. Price Ridley with her air of proprietorship, the tombola where Colonel Melchett looked faintly bewildered by the ticketing system, and the white elephant stall where Mrs. Hartnell held court over a curious assortment of mismatched china, dusty figurines, and half-broken trinkets. But the center of attention this year, besides the vicar's rumored speech, was the charity auction hosted under the large white marquee. Among the lots was a curious object that had already stirred murmurs among the villagers, an antique hand-framed mirror, its silvering mottled with age, said to have hung in the upstairs corridor of Old Parsonage House before its recent sale to a London couple. It was not an especially beautiful thing. Its frame, carved in the heavy, elaborate style of the 1830s, was chipped in places and its surface clouded. But there was something about it, an air of history, perhaps, that drew the eye. Mrs. Price Ridley confided to anyone who would listen that it was quite out of place among the linen tea cloths and crystal decanters on offer, though Miss Marple, glancing at it with mild interest, thought there was a certain curious quality to the way it caught the light. The auction began in good spirits. Mr. Denham, the auctioneer, was a tall man with a ready laugh and a knack for coaxing a bid from even the most reluctant villager. The Mirror came up midway through the sale, and there was a faint ripple of interest. Two bidders, a tall, angular woman in dove gray named Mrs. Charlotte Blackwell, a newcomer to the village, and old Mr. Simpkins, the retired solicitor, seemed equally determined to have it. The bids rose steadily, the small crowd leaning forward in that quiet thrill of watching two people spend more than they had likely intended. At £12, Mr. Simpkins hesitated. At £13, Mrs. Blackwell secured the piece with a nod of satisfaction. Then, it happened so suddenly that afterwards, everyone swore they had barely taken it in. As Mr. Denham lifted the mirror to pass it across the table, there came a sharp, crystalline sound. A single, jagged crack had appeared across the glass, running like lightning from one corner to the other. The crowd murmured. Mr. Denham frowned and set the mirror down, examining it as though it might explain itself. Mrs. Blackwell, her face pale, said nothing, only looking at it as if it had committed some personal affront. Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the group, noticed how quickly Mrs. Blackwell's hand went to her handbag, how her eyes flicked, not to the mirror, but toward the far side of the marquee, where a small cluster of villagers had gathered around someone sitting on the ground. It was Mrs. Lenton, the vicar's wife, who gave voice to what the others were only beginning to realize. "It's Mr. Simpkins," she said, her voice tight. "He's collapsed. Someone fetch Dr. Hayward at once." Within moments, the scene shifted entirely. The mirror was forgotten, left propped against the auction table, the crack glinting faintly in the light. The villagers gathered around the fallen man, whispering about the heat, about his age, about his heart. But when Dr. Hayward arrived, brisk and grave, his expression told a different story. "He's dead," the doctor said simply, "and I'm afraid it's not natural causes." A silence fell over the marquee, broken only by the flutter of bunting outside and the faint thud of the auctioneer's gavel, which had slipped from his grasp. Miss Marple's eyes moved from the doctor to Mrs. Blackwell, who was still standing very still, her fingers pressed so tightly against her handbag that the knuckles showed white. In the distance, a bell rang from the church tower, announcing the hour. Yet in that moment, The pleasant summer day seemed to Miss Marple to have turned quite cold. Chapter 2. The village reacts gossip and theories. By late afternoon, the fate had taken on that suspended, uneasy feeling peculiar to crowds forced into quiet by sudden calamity. The bunting still fluttered. The cake stall stood obstinately cheerful beneath its lace cloths, but conversation settled into little islands of whispering, as if each patch of grass had its own secret tide. Colonel Melchett, who had intended no more official role than buying a plate of sausage rolls for Mrs. Melchett's supper, found himself grimly efficient, posting 2 stalwart churchwardens at the marquee's flap and asking, quite politely but with a soldier's finality, that no one depart the green until names and addresses had been taken. Only a precaution, he said, and most people, relieved to be told what to do, were promptly reassured. A few muttered about the gooseberry jam they had left cooling and geraniums that must be watered at once. Nonetheless, they stayed. Inspector Slack, by contrast, collected facts into corralled statements and found them unaware of his fence. He called on Mr. Denham and left with more confusion about who had actually paid for Lot 35 than he had arrived with. He called on the Grangers and came away irritated by hooks no one had thought to photograph when they held a mirror. He called on Miss Marple and, to his credit, did not scold her for seeing what he preferred not to notice. "It still comes to Mrs. Blackwell with the cup," he said, standing in her small sitting room as if occupying disputed territory. "All this rummaging in cupboards, very pretty, but tea is tea." "Tea," Miss Marple agreed, "is tea, but cups are people. They get muddled, they change partners, they go home with the wrong saucer. And the hand that helps is often the hand that has something put somewhere." "You mean Whitstable," Slack said bluntly. "I mean," Miss Marple returned, "that schoolmasters are very good at moving quietly and that chalk is fond of company. But I also mean that auctions and parishes produce committees like mushrooms after rain, and mushrooms, Inspector, will grow from quite different soils and look very much alike." He stared, decided, sensibly, not to ask for translation, and left with his hat set more firmly. Outside, he met Mr. Denham and spoke to him with an abruptness that made the auctioneer flush. 10 minutes later, Denham was seen at the grocer's declaring that he would not be made a scapegoat for parish muddles, whereupon Mrs. Hartnell declared she had always said his books were too neat to be honest. By evensong, the neatness of Denham's books had become a village sin. By nightfall, the schoolmaster's politeness had joined it. By bedtime, half the high street was convinced that Mrs. Blackwell would sue them all for defamation, which provided general cheer. Miss Marple poured herself a little hot milk and added to her list not new objects but new lines between them. The lemon paperweight had sat on 2 mantels in 1 week. The prayer book with R.S. had been wanted by a hand that ran toward the parsonage hedge. The schoolmaster had known the mirror's back and the inventory of a study where small things could tuck away larger ones. And somewhere behind it all, like a bass line no one heard until it stopped, lay Mr. Simpkins, firm, efficient, and disliked in ways people phrased as not easy. What follows the mirror is what was always behind it. The riddle, like many, was less clever than pretended to be. Miss Marple set down her cup and thought of the next day, which would bring not clarity, but quarrel. Quarrels were useful. They let truth peep out to see the weather. The village would have been content to stand in orderly queues for Inspector Slack's certainty, was developing the disagreeable courage of individuals. The police, she suspected, would not enjoy what came of that, and she, quiet, patient, and not at all tidy in her mind, would be ready to see which threads snapped when people began, as they always do, to pull at one another. Chapter 10. The Final Gathering. It was Colonel Melchett who suggested it. Partly out of exasperation, partly out of soldiers' preference for a clean field. "Let's have them all in one place, Miss Marple," he said. "Slack's making no headway. That doesn't slide away an hour later. If you've something to say, better it be said to every face at once." Miss Marple, who was darning a cuff with the serene precision of one mending a web, looked up mildly. "If we gather them, Colonel, we must do it in the right order. People are far more revealing when they think they've already heard the conclusion." So it was arranged. The parish hall, less festive now than on fete day, was set with 2 long tables, the chairs along one side only, as if for a committee meeting. The mirror, its papers still askew from the vestry incident, sat on a trestle in the background. On the table before the seats lay the lemon paperweight, the 5 matching floral cups, and the 6th, the odd one, still faintly marked 33 beneath its base. They came, each under their own flag of composure. Mrs. Blackwell, precise as always, Mr. Whitstable, pale but courteous, Mr. Denham, a little flushed, Mrs. Hartnell in her gloves, Mrs. Lenton, subdued, the Grangers from the parsonage, and a few others whose names had threaded through the gossip like needles through cloth. Inspector Slack stood at the side, notebook in hand, hat on a peg, watchful, but with the look of a man who suspects the play is about to end without him. Miss Marple began as though discussing parish tea. "We have had," she said gently, "a most unpleasant sequence of events. First, the sudden death of Mr. Simpkins of the Fate, then the break-in at the vestry, and the theft of certain small objects. We might suppose them separate matters, if not for one thing. Everything taken, or nearly taken, belonged once to Rachel Simpkins." Mrs. Lenton stirred. The rest were still. "The mirror was hers," Miss Marple went on, "before it became her brother's. The prayer book bore her initials. The paperweight came from her desk. And lot 35, the box of odds and ends, contained a little frame whose backing had been altered by Rachel long before her death. She was a woman, I am told, who liked things in their proper places, and that included her papers." She turned her mild gaze to Mr. Whitstable. "You saw the car behind the mirror once. RS and a date. You thought it housekeeping. But I believe Rachel hid more than one such card. The prayer book, the paperweight, the frame, each could hide a slip of paper, perhaps with the same inscription." Mr. Whitstable's hand moved slightly on the table, as if smoothing something that was not there. "Mr. Simpkins," Miss Marple continued, "knew this. He also knew that one item of Rachel's contained something of value, something she had not intended for him. He asked you, Mr. Whitstable, to catalog the study at the old parsonage. You, in doing so, saw more than he realized. And when the auction came, you recognized a mirror and knew that the next lot, lot 35, held at least one other piece from Rachel's things. You asked what came after the mirror, because you meant to be certain." Inspector Slack shifted, his frown deepening, but Miss Marple's voice remained even. "You could not bid openly. A schoolmaster buying a lemon paperweight and a worn prayer book would invite questions. So you marked a cup from lot 33, the floral cups, and, when the tea tent bustled, you guided it to Mr. Simpkins' hand. The poison, no more than a pinch, was not for malice sake, but to stop him walking away with the box after the auction. You meant, I think, to take it later yourself in the confusion. But he collapsed before the lots were removed, and the box went into the vestry." Mrs. Blackwell made the smallest sound, a release of breath that was almost a laugh. Miss Marple's eyes rested on Whitstable, who was very still. "When you broke into the vestry," she said softly, "you found the paperweight in the frame, but not the prayer book. Someone else had already taken it. Someone who knew it was Rachel's and guessed it might matter. The vicarage cupboards have seen much coming and going." Mrs. Lenton's face colored faintly. "You tied up the mirror parcel again," Miss Marple went on, "because you could not resist looking behind it as well." The note sent to Inspector Slack. "What follows the mirror is what was always behind it," was meant to suggest a vestry thief sought the mirror alone, not the box. But in truth, it pointed to the sequence you already knew. After the mirror came Rachel's other things. There was a small silence, the kind that hangs on a thread. Mr. Whitstable spoke at last, his voice almost reasonable. It was not money. It was a letter from Rachel to her nephew about property left to him and never claimed. Simpkins meant to keep it. He would have burned it if he'd found it. I wanted only to put it into the right hands." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression grave. "Intent is a difficult measure, Mr. Whitstable. But once a man is dead, the road he walked is less important than the footprint he leaves. You chose a cup and a means that could kill. That cannot be tidied away by reason." Inspector Slack stepped forward then, the business returning to him at last. He said something curt about procedure, and Mr. Whitstable rose, straight back, to go with him. When the others had gone, Mrs. Blackwell with her composure intact. Mrs. Hartnell already composing her version for the high street. Colonel Melchett remained, his face thoughtful. Neat enough in the end, he said, though I can't think how you stitched it so fast. It was not fast, Colonel, Miss Marple said, gathering her knitting bag. It was quite as slow as human nature. The threads were there from the beginning. Cups that didn't match, numbers that wandered, hands that tidied when they should have left well alone. One only had to see how they joined. That evening, St. Marymead resumed its ordinary face with almost indecent speed. At the Blue Boar, they spoke of weather and preserves. At the post office, stamps were discussed with passion. The fate was mentioned only in tones of faint regret, as if its chief fault had been ending too soon. Miss Marple, at her window with a cup of cocoa, allowed herself a small sigh. Villages heal, she knew, but they do not forget. The mirror would hang again somewhere, perhaps over a hallway table, and the lemon paperweight might hold down shopping lists. But in certain cupboards behind more than one door, there would still be small spaces kept empty, because some things once hidden are never quite brought into the light. She picked up her knitting, the needles clicking gently. What follows the mirror, she murmured to herself, is always behind it, and as ever, she knew it was true.